I encountered a problem the other day. All of my pitchers are tired. And I don't know what to do. So, in case you're new to this, this is the 1986 Mets traveling back to 1962 replay. I've been doing this for a little while here on this channel. We're having a hard time recently. We've now lost 5 games in a row. And things are starting to fall apart. We just came off of a really, really rough road trip. I'm trying to figure out what's going wrong. And I'm especially curious to see why our pitchers are all so tired. First of all, as many of you have noted before, in 1986, the Mets only had 24 players on the active roster. This was during the time of collusion. Maybe that's what we're running into, right? Maybe we would have had an extra pitcher if we had the 25th roster spot being used. Now, just so you know, I don't want to cheat, and I'm not going to change this. I want to play with the Mets as they were in 1986, keeping the day-to-day rosters as even as I possibly can. I don't want to throw in a player from the minor leagues or do anything like that to try to give myself an advantage. The purpose of this experiment is to see how the 1986 Mets would compete in 1962 while keeping player usage more or less as realistic as I can possibly make it. So while the 24-player issue might be the source of the problem, we're not going to do anything about that. That's not going to change. But I looked at a couple of other things. I thought, first of all, maybe there are too many doubleheaders. Now, when I first thought of this project, I thought, oh, I'm going to use the as-scheduled schedule and then let OOTP come up with its random delays, rain, and all the other stuff. But I accidentally used the as-played schedule, so we're using the as-played schedule. I will note that I've added 2 extra games in for the Mets, 2 extra doubleheaders. In real life, the Mets were 40 and 120 in 1962. Of course, when you add that together, that means 160 games. Knowing that the 86 Mets might compete for the pennant, I wanted to make sure that we had 162 games. And so as a result, I gave the Mets an extra 2 extra doubleheaders, one of which was on June 23rd in New York. I made sure that instead of playing 1 game against the Colt 45s, the Mets played 2 games in our replay. But then we had the 24th off, which is what happened in real life. It rained that day, unfortunately. That was the end of the home stretch and started the road stretch, which started June 25th and then moved up through July 4th. We've had nothing but single games from June 25th through July 3rd, after which we had our July 4th doubleheader in San Francisco. Now, that's not a crazy doubleheader schedule, right? I thought at first, oh, the doubleheaders are going to kill me, but look at that. We've had all of these games in a row that have been single games, not doubleheaders. The only doubleheader we had was the July 4th doubleheader, and in the second game we had no pitchers that we could use. That's nothing compared to what's happened in baseball history, right? You want to know about a crazy doubleheader schedule? Play with the 1928 Boston Braves. They had 9 doubleheaders in a row between September 4th and September 15th. They did have 3 days off in that stretch, but you have nothing but doubleheaders for 2 weeks, right? How do you manage that pitching staff? So the problem's not really the doubleheaders, it's not really the schedule, right? Maybe the problem is me. Maybe I've been managing the pitchers wrong. Now, there are 2 possibilities I can think of. Number 1 is that I have too many complete games. Now, this one is tricky because we're playing with the 86 Mets in 1962. I don't know exactly how OOTP makes adjustments for this type of league and this type of setup. I can assume, based on what I know, having played Action PC Baseball and Diamond Mine Baseball in similar circumstances, it's possible that we have too many complete games and that I'm doing the thing that I always do. I'm just not taking the pitchers out. Well, then I went and checked the stats, and while we are leading both leagues in complete games, we're not leading them by a huge margin. I really don't think this is what's causing the problem. In fact, if anything, it seems to me like the 86 Mets in this project are pitching as if they had the fatigue settings of 1962, which is what I wanted. So that's a definite big plus for OOTP. Everything seems to be realistic for 1962. Now, I don't know, again, exactly what the game considers realistic and so on and so forth. Now, the other thing I thought about was, well, maybe there could be something going on with fatigue. So I don't know much about how fatigue works in OOTP. In fact, nobody knows. There's some really vague information available in the OOTP manual, the online manual. I don't know. It tells you that players will get tired, pitchers get tired depending upon the pitch count. They get tired depending upon the amount of rest that they've had. They won't pitch so well. They do have fatigue that accumulates over the course of the season. But that's all really generic in general. And I mean, I don't want to go around and guess. I really don't care that much about how the algorithm actually works. I just want to solve this problem. So I went and looked back at my settings, and I realized that when I started the season, I put everybody on a 4-man pitching rotation. I did it for the whole league. We've been running a 4-man pitching rotation so far, which is the problem. I'll show you what the problem is. So when we look here at the Mets starting pitching over this stretch, you can see that everybody, with the exception of Ron Darling once, has been pitching with 3 days rest. That's what the problem is. In real life, the 86 Mets did not pitch with 3 days rest. When you go look at Baseball Reference, you'll see that Gooden pitched with 4 days rest, sometimes 5. Darling with 4. Bob Ojeda usually with 4. Sid Fernandez with 4, occasionally with 3, but very, very rarely. So how can you do that? How can you have a bunch of guys pitching on 4 days rest with a 4-man rotation? Well, the answer is obvious. They had a 5-man rotation. The 5th man was Rick Aguilera, who I've been using as a long relief man. So I made the change. I went into the game and made Aguilera the number 5 starter and put everything up to the 5-man starting rotation. Now, theoretically, before we had Bruce Bereni as our theoretical 5th starter. His usage, by the way, has been a little bit bizarre. We pitched him on June 20th, and he pitched like an inning or 2. And then he had 2 weeks off until he pitched a third of an inning in the first game of that July 4th doubleheader, and that was too much for him. He couldn't start in the second game. So, go figure. Anyway, the solution was simple here. I set the starting rotation to a 5-man rotation. Bereni's going to be a long reliever. We'll get Rick into the rotation, and that should make it work out. Now, you're probably as curious as I am as to what happened to the Mets in real life, and I'll show you. In real life, the 1962 Mets, during this stretch, had all sorts of rest for their pitchers. The only one who didn't have a whole bunch of rest was Roger Craig, who pitched once on 3 days rest. Other than that, it was a lot of 5 days rest, 5 days rest, some guys with 7 days rest, a guy with 6 days rest. Now, Casey Stengel was doing a lot of experimenting with young players and with guys who really couldn't make it. So, I mean, we can definitely understand what happened and why the 62 Mets ended up with so much rest and why their starters were that way. It's a little bit different with the 86 Mets that have really a set rotation. I decided then to look through history to see if I could find any other examples of 3 days rest killing you. Those of you who know your baseball history know exactly what I'm going to talk about before I say it, so here it is. This is a graph of the pitching rest for the 1964 Phillies, who had 3 days rest for the entire month of September when they blew it. Gene Mauch was just killer, especially on Jim Bunning, who pitched twice near the end of the season with only 2 days rest. It definitely didn't work, and it's bizarre that it didn't work because they could have started a number of these guys, Wise or Mahaffey, for example, more regularly. You could have easily started them more regularly and given your pitchers 1 extra day of rest, and then the 64 Phillies likely would have won the pennant. Now, the last thing I wanted to look at, out of curiosity, is how in the world those 1928 Braves were able to do it with all those doubleheaders. And when you look at this, you'll see that for the most part, they had a lot of rest. They started a whole bunch of different pitchers. Now, there is one thing that will stand out to you when you look at it. One pitcher ended up starting with both games of a doubleheader, and that's Bob Smith. Bob Smith started on the first game of the September 14th, 1928 doubleheader, and then he started again in the second game. What happened is in the first game, he was knocked out of the box in the first inning. and didn't pitch very well. And then in the second game, he lasted 6 1/3 and lost that game as well. You haven't heard much about Bob Smith. There's a reason why. Unfortunately, Bob Smith was not a particularly good pitcher on Boston teams that were really bad. So there you have it. The answer to the problem is to make sure that you have a 5-man pitching rotation, not a 4-man rotation. I know what you're thinking. You're probably like me and you're thinking, oh, well, back in the day, everybody did a 4-man rotation. Go do your homework and you'll find that they didn't. Bye-bye.